What we want to do before we really get started is create ourselves a service template that we can reuse for every service we create. So to do that, we're going to start by just creating a generic serverless project with the AWS Node.js template from which we can build the rest of our template on. With that created, you can see we've got our 3 files here. And to get started, we're going to edit our serverless.yaml file to add a few defaults for us for every service that we're going to use. I'm just going to close the terminal. And first, I'm going to start with the service name. And I just want to make this something a little bit more generic that can be reused very easily in future services. And then I'm going to add some defaults for the stage and the region so that these make sense no matter what service we are using. And I usually like to point this out to be using the stage option from the CLI if I'm running a deploy command from there, and then default dev if there isn't one provided, and US East 1 just because that's a good default to use. So the next step is let's go create some folders for us so we can organize our code a bit better. And in general, I tend to like to create a source folder, SRC folder. And then I'm going to break it down into 2 separate folders, one for functions and another for tests, so that I just organize those a bit more cleanly. And you'll see how this becomes useful in a minute again. So back on the command line here, I'm just going to install a couple of plugins as well. So we're going to be using, for the first plugin, we're going to be using the serverless sudo parameters plugin. And what this does is this allows us to configure items in our serverless.yaml file that we can use specific parameters to access details such as the region and AWS account ID we want to use. So it just makes life a little bit easier in that way. And the next plugin we're installing is going to be the Serverless Mocha plugin. And this is going to allow us to set up unit testing in our services. But these unit tests are not necessarily there for unit testing itself, but as a way to help us just execute code on our local machine without having to always deploy into an AWS environment to test them. And with those plugins installed, you should be able to see we have the plugins now listed automatically in our serverless.yaml file, and they're installed. Now let's do as a test, we're going to create a new function. So the Serverless Mocha plugin adds a new option in our command line to create a function. And this allows us to create a brand new bootstrapped function based on a built-in template with the plugin, as well as a test that is hooked up to that new function so that it's very easy to, from that point, execute tests by importing the function code we write for our Lambda functions, and then running that in a command line to make sure we don't have syntax errors or the like. Yeah, we can go take a look and look at our functions now. We have the default function here, nothing terribly complicated. This is just the default created by the Serverless Mocha plugin, and then the default test as well created by the same plugin. But we probably want to go ahead and change this and edit it to match what we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our node modules folder here and find the Serverless Mocha plugin that was installed. And we're just going to grab a copy of the default tests that were created for the plugin, and we're just going to copy those so that we can just edit them to match our needs. So if I just select both of them and copy, and then just paste them into a new folder that I'm going to create called templates. And now we should have some baseline templates that we can reuse and make changes to fit what we need. Starting with our function template, we can make a couple of changes here. There's nothing extreme to do here. The first thing we're going to do is remove this return response. We're just going to return the response object immediately in our function code. And then switching to our test template, we're going to make some changes here as well. And one of the things we want to do is install a new node module called AWS SDK mock. And this is going to help us because if we want to execute function code locally and we have requests to AWS services, this can cause a problem because we don't necessarily want to call those AWS services every time we run a test. So the AWS SDK mock tool allows us to capture requests to those AWS services and then return whichever response we like. For the simplest case, you'll just return a successful response. And what we're going to do is, in our test, we're going to override our AWS constant with the AWS SDK mock tool. We also need to import the AWS SDK itself properly. And then we need to make sure that the AWS SDK mock tool is pointed at a valid AWS SDK so that it knows what to capture and how. And this is what makes this really cool, because the AWS SDK mock tool will always work because it's using a current AWS SDK. Next step, we want to just correct the function paths here. By default, the Serverless Mocker plugin doesn't necessarily handle our directory structure very cleanly. There we go. And lastly, let's just correct this require for the Mocker plugin itself and remove the dash plugin portion. And there we go. Now that we have our templates done, we need to set up the reference to our new templates so that the Serverless Mocker plugin uses our templates instead of the defaults. And this is just done with a custom entry into the serverless.yaml file, adding Serverless Mocker plugin, and then a reference to the test template and the function template that we wanted to use. There we go. We now have both. I'm just deleting the previous invocations that we created with our little test, as well as the entry in the serverless.yaml file so that we can retest creating our template. And here's the same command we ran before. I'm just going to run this again, which should now use our new templates that we created in our templates folder. And if we run Mocker, the Mocker test, we can see our test has passed inside our tests folder. And if we look at our function and our test itself, you can see these are the new versions of our tests and our function. And that's it. We are now complete.